News Talk on Samar News, your go-to podcast for the latest headlines and in-depth discussions. Join us as we unravel the stories that matter most, bringing you insightful commentary and expert analysis. Tune in for thought-provoking conversations that spark dialogue and inspire action. Stay connected with the news that shapes our world, only on News Talk on Samar News.
So you sent over some really interesting pieces this time, all pointing towards, well, a pretty significant showdown in higher education.
Yeah, absolutely. And right at the center is Harvard University, looking at a $2.2 billion freeze on federal funding.
Wow, $2.2 billion. That's a staggering amount.
It really is. And as the sources make clear, this isn't just some bureaucratic shuffle. It's a direct result of Harvard pushing back, refusing demands from the Trump administration.
Demands specifically about anti-Semitism on campus.
That's how it's being framed, yes. That's the core justification given by the administration for this action.
Okay, so let's dig into that. What were these demands exactly? The materials suggested it started with things like diversity offices and cooperating with ICE.
That's right. The initial focus was on those areas, but it didn't stay there. The scope widened pretty dramatically.
How so?
Well, the administration's demands started touching on really fundamental aspects of how Harvard operates. Things like their governance structure, faculty hiring processes, even undergraduate admissions.
Admissions, too. Okay.
Yeah, and probably the most, let's say, controversial part, at least from Harvard's viewpoint, was this call for some kind of, well, they called it an audit of student and faculty viewpoints.
An audit of viewpoints. That immediately jumps out. It sounds like a direct challenge to academic freedom, doesn't it?
It certainly seems that way, and Harvard definitely didn't just, accept it.
Right. President Garber's response seemed quite firm based on the letter you shared.
Extremely firm. He basically drew a line in the sand, made it clear Harvard would not, quote, negotiate over its independence or its constitutional rights. A very strong statement.
Okay, so Harvard says no negotiation on independence. How did the administration react then?
Predictably, they didn't back down. The Joint Task Force to Combat Anti-Semitism put out a statement, and that's where this huge hold was announced, the $2.2 billion in multi-year grants, plus another $60 million in government contracts frozen.
And their justification?
Their core argument is basically that getting federal money comes with strings attached, specifically the responsibility to follow civil rights laws.
So they're saying Harvard isn't upholding those laws?
Essentially, yes. The task force statement talked about accountability, suggesting some universities have an entitlement mindset, thinking they can take taxpayer money without real oversight. They pointed specifically to what they called disruption of learning and harassment of Jewish students.
And this is all happening, as the background material showed, in the context of those really intense campus protests last year about the war in Gaza.
Exactly. That's a crucial backdrop. There were definitely accusations flying around then, particularly from some political corners, about anti-Semitism, even claims of support for Hamas within those protests.
Right. So those protests really put universities under the microscope.
Undeniably. And it's important to remember, this isn't just Harvard. The Department of Education, back in March, I think your sources noted, announced investigations into, 60 colleges.
60? Wow.
Yes, 60 institutions for alleged anti-Semitic harassment and discrimination. So this seems to be part of a much wider federal push.
And I remember reading in one of the pieces you sent that this $2.2 billion freeze isn't even the whole picture. There's already a review ongoing for $9 billion in federal funds going to Harvard and its affiliates.
That's right. That larger pool of funding was already under scrutiny, apparently triggered by those initial demands.
Yeah.
So this latest action, freezing the $2.2 billion, it really escalates things.
Which definitely sounds like more than just a warning shot.
Precisely. It shows the potential scale of the financial fallout if Harvard continues to resist. This isn't just political theater. It could have very real, very substantial impacts on the university.
Okay, so we've laid out the main conflict. Harvard pushes back on demands about anti-Semitism. The administration freezes billions in funding. We see the arguments from both sides. So why should someone listening really care about this? What are the bigger issues here?
Well, at its core, this whole situation forces us to grapple with some pretty fundamental questions, It's about the relationship between the federal government and private universities. Where does the government's role in enforcing civil rights end? And where does the university's right to, run itself and pursue its mission begin?
That's a tricky balance, isn't it? It really feels like a collision between those two ideas.
It absolutely is. And Harvard's stance, invoking his constitutional rights, clearly shows they see these demands as a serious overreach.
They're basically saying the government shouldn't dictate curriculum or hiring or research.
That seems to be the gist of it. President Garber's letters, as we saw, argued that no outside government body should control those core academic functions. They see it as an attack on academic freedom itself.
But then you have the other side, the Joint Task Force, saying, wait a minute, you take public money, you have responsibilities.
Exactly. Their argument is pretty straightforward. Federal funding isn't a blank check. It comes with a non-negotiable duty to provide a safe, non-discriminatory environment.
And they feel Harvard failed on that front, specifically regarding anti-Semitism.
That's their assertion, yes.
Yes.
They see it as a breach of responsibility that justifies withholding funds. And, this also connects to broader political debates about perceived bias in higher education.
It's definitely become politicized. The reactions mentioned in the articles were all over the map, right? Liberals supporting Harvard's stand against overreach, conservatives criticizing the university.
Right. Those reactions really highlight the deep ideological divides around issues like free speech, academic freedom, and what the role of a university even is in society today. It's not just a bureaucratic fight.
Okay, let's get down to brass tacks then. What are the actual real-world effects of this funding freeze? $2.2 billion in grants, $60 million in contracts. What does that mean on the ground?
The impact could be, well, pretty significant, especially for a place like Harvard that does so much research. The T.H. Chan School of Public Health is a really stark example mentioned in the sources.
Oh.
Apparently, for fiscal year 2025, something like 46% of their entire budget comes from federal funding. That's almost half.
46%. Wow. That's huge.
It is. And most of that money goes directly into research, funding the scientists, the labs, the equipment, everything needed to actually do the work.
And didn't one article mention a specific researcher being told to stop their work?
Yes, that was a really concrete example.
Yeah.
Sarah Fortune, a prominent tuberculosis researcher, reportedly received instructions from the feds to halt her research project because of this freeze. That's immediate.
That's concerning, halting TB research.
Absolutely. And Dean Andrea Baccarelli from the Chan School, his statement really drove home how crucial this funding is. He talked about countless discoveries and solutions that have saved tens of millions of lives, all enabled by this federal partnership.
What kind of research did he mention specifically?
Things like cancer, Alzheimer's, stroke, HIV, also work on, environmental health, public health policies that affect everyone. This funding supports a massive range of vital work.
It puts things in perspective. He also brought up that researcher, Alberto Asherio, right? The one who won the Breakthrough Prize for linking Epstein-Barr virus to MS.
Exactly. Federally funded work that could potentially lead to a vaccine or new treatments for multiple sclerosis. A huge deal for millions.
And that's now at risk.
According to Dean Baccarelli, yes. He explicitly said the freeze puts that critical research at significant risk and threatens important gains in public health. It really highlights that these aren't just numbers on a spreadsheet. It's about real science, real potential breakthroughs.
Now, it's important we also note Harvard isn't just saying no and digging in its heels, right?
What?
The sources mentioned they are taking steps against anti-Semitism.
That's a key point they're making, yes.
Yeah.
While they're fighting what they see as overreach, President Garber has talked about specific initiatives they put in place over the last 15 months or so to combat anti-Semitism.
And they mentioned complying with the Supreme Court decision on admissions, too.
Right. They emphasize their compliance with that ruling and their efforts to foster viewpoint diversity. So their argument seems to be, we are addressing these issues, but the government's current tactics, these broad demands and funding threats, are the wrong way to go about it and violate our autonomy.
It's interesting to compare Harvard's very public fight with how other universities handled similar pressure. Columbia came up in the materials.
Yes, Columbia faced similar threats from the administration over their handling of pro-Palestinian protests.
But they took a different approach.
A very different path, it seems. They ended up agreeing to changes, reforms to student discipline, hiring more security, things like that. Basically, they made concessions to keep the federal funding flowing.
Whereas Harvard seems to be going the other way, even teaming up with MIT. Didn't MIT sue the Department of Energy?
That's right. MIT filed a lawsuit over terminated grants. So you see some universities pushing back legally, taking a more confrontational stance, similar to Harvard's current posture.
It really shows the different calculations these institutions are making. It's a tough spot.
Incredibly tough. They're balancing financial needs, academic principles, political pressures. It's a high-wire act.
So let's try and wrap this up. Based on everything we've looked at, we have this major clash. Harvard versus the Trump administration over anti-Semitism demands, leading to a massive $2.2 billion funding freeze.
Right, with potentially more financial pain to come.
We've heard both sides. The government citing civil rights responsibility that comes with funding.
And Harvard asserting its independence and constitutional rights, warning against government intrusion into academic affairs.
We've seen the potential impact, especially on vital research at places like the Chan School of Public Health. TB research halted, potential MS treatments threatened.
Really serious consequences for science and public health.
And we've contrasted Harvard's defiance with Columbia's more conciliatory approach and MIT's legal challenge.
Showing there's no single playbook for universities facing this kind of pressure.
Exactly. Harvard is standing firm on independence while the administration insists on accountability with federal dollars. The outcome here could really set a precedent.
It absolutely could. It might reshape how universities interact with the federal government, particularly around sensitive social and political issues.
Which brings us to a final thought for everyone listening. Thinking about all this, the funding, the autonomy, the duty to fight discrimination, where do you think the line should be drawn? How do we balance university independence with ensuring safe environments funded by taxpayers? And what might the long-term ripple effects of this Harvard situation be for higher education and the research we all rely on?
Yeah, those are the big questions, aren't they? No easy answers, and definitely something that bears watching closely as it continues to unfold.
News Talk on Samar News, your go-to podcast for the latest headlines and in-depth discussions. Join us as we unravel the stories that matter most, bringing you insightful commentary and expert analysis. Tune in for thought-provoking conversations that spark dialogue and inspire action. Stay connected with the news that shapes our world, only on News Talk on Samar News.